The stagecoach kicked up a cloud of dust that hung in the air like a ghost. Inside, a woman named Eliza Trent held a wrinkled letter in her hands, and they were shaking. Her dress was faded, her boots were scuffed, and her heart was a cold, hard knot in her chest. She was running from a past so dark it didn't have a name, and running toward a future that had no light. The letter was her last chance, her only chance. A rancher she'd never met, a man named Colton Wren, needed a wife. He'd promised safety. He'd promised a home. He had no idea what he was really inviting into his life. When the stagecoach groaned to a stop in a forgotten town called Westwood, Eliza stepped out into a world made of judgment. Men standing outside the saloon stopped talking. Their eyes crawled over her faded dress, her worn-out boots. One of them laughed, a low, cruel sound that cut right through her. This was a mistake, a terrible, terrible mistake. Then a man on a brown horse rode toward her. He was tall, with a strong jaw, and eyes that looked like they hadn't seen a reason to smile in a long, long time. This was him. This had to be Colton Wren. He swung down from his horse, and his eyes swept over her, not with kindness, but with assessment. She saw the surprise. She saw the doubt. He was expecting someone else, anyone else but her. "You're Eliza?" he asked, his voice quiet and rough, like stones grinding together. She couldn't speak, so she just nodded, holding out the letter like it was a shield. He took it, glanced at it, then looked back at her. The silence stretched out, so heavy and awkward it felt like you could drown in it. "You look different than I thought," he said. It wasn't mean, just honest. And sometimes honesty is the cruelest thing of all. She followed him out of town, walking while his horse walked beside them. The road was long and dry, and the silence between them was a physical weight. His ranch wasn't a promise of a new life. It was a simple, tired-looking place. A small wooden house, a barn, and fences that looked as broken as she felt. "This is it," he said, and the words held no pride. The house smelled of old wood, dust, and loneliness. There was one table, 2 chairs, and a single, narrow bed. "You can have the bed," he said, not looking at her. "I'll sleep in the barn." He left, and the door closed behind him with a sound of finality, like a coffin lid shutting. Eliza sat by the small, dirty window, watching the stars fill up the massive, empty sky. She had run so far, but she knew, deep in her bones, that she hadn't run far enough, because the men who were hunting her were not the kind of men who ever gave up. And what she didn't know, what Colton couldn't possibly know, was that she hadn't just brought a bag and a letter to his ranch. She had brought a death sentence. The first week passed in a haze of unspoken words. Colton was a man made of silence and hard work. He was out before the sun came up, mending those broken fences, tending to the few cattle he owned. He moved with a slow, deliberate strength that made Eliza feel both safe and incredibly small. She did what she could. She cleaned the dusty cabin, scrubbing away the loneliness, turning it from a shelter into something that almost felt like a home. She cooked simple meals of beans and bread. They ate at that small table, the space between them a canyon of things they couldn't bring themselves to say. She learned the landscape of his face, the deep lines the sun had etched around his eyes, the permanent frown that seemed carved into his features. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a stormy sky, and in their depths she saw a loneliness that was a perfect mirror of her own. Sometimes he would watch her when he thought she wasn't looking. He saw the way she flinched at loud noises. He saw the haunted look in her eyes when she stared out at the long, empty road leading back to town. He knew she was running from something. Every stray dog knows the look of another stray. But he never asked, because asking questions meant getting answers, and Colton Wren had enough ghosts of his own. His brother, Liam, younger by 5 years, with a laugh that could fill up a whole valley, and then, one day, gone. Vanished without a trace 2 years ago. The sheriff said he'd probably just gotten tired of ranch life and moved on. Colton knew that was a lie. Liam loved this land more than he loved breathing. Something bad had happened out here on these plains, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound Colton had ever heard. One afternoon, Eliza was in the small garden, trying to coax life from the stubborn soil, when she saw a rider approaching. It wasn't Colton. This man was different. He rode a sleek black horse and wore a fine black coat. He looked like a crow, a messenger of bad news sent from hell itself. He stopped at the edge of the property, his eyes scanning the ranch with an owner's arrogance. He looked at the house, at the barn, and then his gaze settled on her. It was a cold, calculating stare that made her blood run cold. She felt like a mouse that had just been spotted by a hawk. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The man just smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his pale face. Then he turned his horse and rode away, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared, leaving a chill in the air. When Colton got back that evening, she told him. She described the man, the horse, the coldness in his eyes. Colton's face went hard. The little bit of warmth she had started to see in him over the past week vanished, replaced by a storm. "That sounds like Marcus Thorne," he said, his voice a low growl. "He's the foreman for the Westwood Cattle Company, the biggest, meanest operation in the territory." "What would he want here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Colton looked out at his small, struggling ranch. "The same thing he always wants. More. He's been trying to buy me out for years. Says this land is no good for a small operation." He kicked at the dirt, a gesture of helpless anger. "My brother, Liam, he had a run-in with Thorne's men a week before he disappeared." The air in the kitchen grew thick and cold. The pieces were starting to connect, forming a picture that was dark and terrifying. Thorne wasn't just a foreman. He was a predator. That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. The image of the man in black was burned into her mind. She thought he was one of her ghosts, come back to haunt her. But he wasn't. He was one of Colton's. And now their ghosts were starting to meet in the shadows of the ranch. She crept out of the house and went to the barn. She found Colton there, not sleeping, but cleaning his rifle, his movements sharp and precise in the moonlight that streamed through the cracks in the walls. "He's the reason your brother is gone, isn't he?" she whispered into the darkness. Colton didn't look up from his work. "The law says there's no proof." "And what do you say?" He finally stopped, looking at her, his stormy eyes full of a pain so deep it stole her breath. "I say the law is a long way from here." She knew then. She knew that this quiet, broken man was capable of a violence she could only imagine. And she knew that by staying here, she had stepped right into the middle of a war that had started long before she ever arrived. The next morning, the trouble they had been waiting for rode right up to their door. It wasn't just Marcus Thorne this time. He brought the town sheriff with him, a portly man with a shiny badge and eyes that wouldn't look you in the face. "Colton," the sheriff said, not quite meeting his gaze, "we've had a complaint. Some folks in town say you're harboring a fugitive." Eliza's heart didn't just stop. It shattered. Fugitive. They knew. Her past had found her. Colton stepped in front of her, his body a solid wall between her and the world. "This is my wife," he said, the words coming out low and steady. It was the first time he had called her that, and it felt more real than any vow. Thorne laughed, a sound like gravel grinding together. "Wife? That's a good one. We have a wanted poster, Wren. From back east, a young woman named Eliza Trent, wanted for the murder of her own father." The lie was so stunning, so absolute, that for a moment Eliza couldn't breathe. Murder? Her father had been a monster, a drunk who had made her life a living hell. She had run from him, yes, but she hadn't killed him. She hadn't. "That's a lie," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "Is it?" Thorne said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat. He held it up. "Looks just like you. Says you shot him in the back and stole all his money." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Now, Eliza, we can sort this all out nice and quiet. You just come with us back to town." It was a trap. She knew it in her soul. If she went with them, she would never be seen again. They would say she tried to escape, that they had no choice but to put a bullet in her. "She's not going anywhere," Colton said, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his Colt revolver. "Don't be a fool, Wren," Thorne sneered. "She's not worth dying for. She's a killer. It's probably in her blood." Suddenly, another rider appeared. He came out of nowhere, his horse moving at a full gallop, kicking up dust and chaos. He was covered in dust and blood, his face a mask of desperation. It was Jared, an outlaw she had helped a few nights ago, giving him water and food when no one else would. He pulled his horse to a skidding stop right between Colton and the sheriff. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," Jared panted, his eyes wild with the terrible truth. "I was there. I saw what really happened." Everyone froze. Thorne's smug expression faltered, just for a second. "I was with her father that night," Jared said, his words coming in a rush of confession. "He was a bad man, owed a lot of money to the wrong people, people who sent Marcus Thorne here to collect." Jared pointed a trembling finger at Thorne. "He's the one who killed him, shot him in the back when he wouldn't pay. He saw the girl running, and he saw a perfect way to cover his tracks. He framed her. He made the whole thing up." The world went silent. The only sound was the wind, whispering a terrible secret through the dry grass. The truth was out, a truth so ugly and twisted it was almost too much to believe. Thorne wasn't just a greedy foreman. He was a killer, and he had been hunting her, not for a crime she committed, but for one he had. Thorne's face became a mask of pure rage. He went for his gun. But Colton was faster. His gun was already out, the barrel pointed steady and true at Thorne's black heart. "It's over, Thorne," Colton said, his voice as cold as a grave. Thorne just laughed, a crazy, unhinged sound that echoed across the plains. "You think this is over? You have no idea what you've just stepped into." He looked past Colton, past Eliza, at something behind them. A slow, triumphant, evil smile spread across his face. "You're right," he said. "I did kill her father, and now I'm going to kill his other daughter, too." The world tilted on its axis. Eliza stared at him, her mind refusing to process the words. Other daughter? She didn't have a sister. She was an only child, wasn't she? And then she saw it. A movement at the edge of the property. A fourth rider emerging from the trees like a nightmare. A woman. She rode a fine horse and wore a fine dress. And as she got closer, Eliza saw her face. It was a face she knew. A face she had seen every single day of her life. In the mirror. She had an identical twin, a sister she never knew existed. And that sister was pointing a rifle directly at her heart. The woman on the horse looked exactly like Eliza, the same face, the same eyes. But where Eliza's expression was full of shock and confusion, this woman's was cold, hard, and full of a chilling certainty. "Hello, sister," the woman said, her voice dripping with venom. "Surprised to see me?" Eliza couldn't speak. Her mind was a whirlwind of impossible questions. A twin. How? Why? "Her name is Clara," Thorne said, his voice full of smug satisfaction. "Your father was a clever man. He knew one day his debts would come due. So he kept a spare, an insurance policy. He raised you in filth and fear, while he raised her in a fine boarding school back east. He told her you were dead. He told everyone you were dead." Clara's eyes, so much like her own, raked over Eliza with pure contempt. "I was supposed to inherit everything," she spat. "But then you ran. You messed up the whole plan. When Thorn found you, I realized we could kill two birds with one stone. Get rid of you and have a perfect scapegoat for our father's murder. It was a nightmare. Her whole life had been a lie, a carefully constructed prison designed to protect this other person, this perfect, evil copy of herself. You won't get away with this, Colton growled, his gun still trained on Thorn. We already have, Thorn said with a sneer. The law is on our side. He nodded at the sheriff, who was now sweating profusely, his hand hovering over his own gun. And we have the numbers. Suddenly, from the barn, a shot rang out. The sheriff cried out and grabbed his hand, his pistol clattering to the dust. Jared, the outlaw, stood in the barn doorway, a smoking rifle in his hands. He'd circled around while they were talking, unnoticed. Looks like the numbers just changed, Jared said, his voice steady as a rock. Thorn stared at him, then at Clara. The perfect plan was falling apart. He snarled and fired at Colton. But Eliza moved. In that split second, she didn't think. She acted. She shoved Colton hard, pushing him out of the way. The bullet that was meant for him tore through her shoulder instead. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded through her. She cried out and fell to the ground. "Eliza!" Colton's voice was a roar of fury and anguish. He turned and fired, his shot hitting Thorn squarely in the chest. The big man staggered back, a look of surprise on his face, before collapsing in a heap, dead before he hit the ground. Clara screamed, a sound of pure rage and frustration. She raised her rifle to fire at Colton, but Jared was already there. He fired again, his aim true. Clara's rifle flew from her hands as the bullet struck her arm. She cried out in pain and spurred her horse, galloping away before anyone could stop her. The sheriff, clutching his wounded hand, scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing into the chaos like the coward he was. It was over in seconds. Dust and silence fell. Colton rushed to Eliza's side, his face a mask of terror. "Eliza, stay with me," he pleaded, tearing a strip from his shirt to press against the bleeding wound. "It's okay," she whispered, the world starting to go fuzzy around the edges. "It's okay." Jared ran over. "We have to get her inside. That bullet needs to come out, and fast." They carried her into the small house, the house that had started to feel like a home, and laid her on the bed. As Jared worked to remove the bullet, his hands surprisingly steady, Colton knelt beside her, holding her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "You could have been killed." She looked at him, at his stormy eyes now filled with a terrifying vulnerability. "You said I was your wife," she whispered, a faint smile touching her lips. "I guess I was just acting like it." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, not caring about the blood or the dirt. "You are more than that, Eliza," he said, his voice breaking. "So much more." The next few days were a blur of pain and fevered dreams. But through it all, Colton was there. He never left her side. He bathed her forehead, he fed her broth, he talked to her, telling her stories of the land, of his brother, of a future he was only just beginning to believe in. Jared stayed too. He stood guard, his rifle never far from his reach. He knew Clara and the corrupt sheriff wouldn't just disappear. They had lost the battle, but the war for Westwood was just beginning. On the third day, the fever broke. Eliza woke to the feeling of a cool cloth on her forehead, and the sight of Colton asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head resting on his arms, his hand still holding hers. She knew then. She knew that this man, this quiet, broken rancher, was her home. Not the land, not the house. Him. When he woke and saw her looking at him, a slow smile spread across his face, a real smile that reached his eyes and changed everything. "Welcome back," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere," she replied. But the peace was short-lived. That afternoon, a rider approached the ranch. It was one of the local farmers, his face grim with bad news. "You need to know," the farmer said, twisting his hat in his hands. "Sheriff Miller is organizing a posse. He's telling everyone that Jared here is a known killer and that you two are his accomplices. He says you killed Thorne in cold blood. He's coming for you. All of you." Jared's face went pale. "He's twisting it, turning the whole town against us." "And Clara?" Colton asked, his voice dangerously low. "She's with him," the farmer said, "telling everyone that her poor lost sister was a violent criminal who tried to kill her. She's playing the victim, and they're believing her." They were trapped. The law, the town, everything was now against them. They were outlaws, framed for crimes they didn't commit, with a lynch mob on its way to their door. "We can't fight a whole town," Jared said, his voice full of despair. "No," Colton said, his eyes hard as stone as he looked at Eliza, still pale in the bed. "We can't, so we're going to have to do something else." He walked over to a loose floorboard in the corner of the room and pried it up. From the space beneath, he pulled out a heavy leather saddlebag. He opened it on the table and Eliza gasped. It was full of money, more money than she had ever seen in her entire life. "This was my brother's," Colton said, his voice low and full of pain. "He was saving it. He was going to leave. He told me that this ranch wasn't just a home. It was a prison. He said the whole town was rotten, right to the core. I didn't believe him." He looked at Eliza, his eyes full of a terrible regret. "I should have." "What are you saying?" she asked, sitting up despite the pain in her shoulder. "I'm saying we stop playing by their rules," he said, his voice ringing with a new, dangerous conviction. "The sheriff wants a war. He's going to get one. But we're not going to fight it here. We're going to take the fight to him." He looked from Eliza's determined face to Jared's fearful one. "We're not just going to clear our names," he said. "We're going to burn their whole corrupt world to the ground." They didn't wait for the posse to come to them. They rode out to meet it under the cover of darkness. Colton's plan was desperate, reckless, and absolutely brilliant. He knew this land, every canyon, every hidden trail, every shadow. The sheriff and his mob of angry townsfolk were predictable. They would come straight down the main road, torches held high. Colton, Eliza, and Jared did not. They used a secret network of ravines and gullies that crisscrossed the plains, a map that only Colton and his brother had ever known. They circled the posse, moving like ghosts in the night, silent and deadly. "The sheriff is a coward," Colton whispered as they watched the flickering torchlight of the mob from a high ridge. "He'll keep the honest men in the front. His paid guns, the ones who work for the cattle company, will be in the back, protecting him and Clara." "So we take out the back," Eliza said, her voice steady. The pain in her shoulder was a dull, throbbing ache, but her mind was sharp, her resolve like steel. They hit the posse from 3 sides at once. It wasn't a battle. It was a calculated, terrifying disruption. They fired into the air, they yelled from the darkness, they used the echoes of the canyons to make their 3 rifles sound like 30. The honest farmers and ranchers at the front of the posse, men who were already uneasy about hunting down their neighbors, panicked. They had signed up for an arrest, not a full-blown ambush in the dead of night. Horses reared, men shouted in confusion. The front half of the posse broke and fled back towards the safety of town. It was exactly what Colton had predicted. That left the sheriff, Clara, and a handful of Thorne's hired guns, now exposed and isolated in the darkness. "Show yourselves!" the sheriff screamed into the night, his voice shaking with fear. "Give it up, Miller," Colton's voice boomed from the rocks above them. "It's over." Then a shot rang out from the darkness where the posse had been, not from Colton's group. It was one of the ranchers, one of the men who had fled. He had circled back. He had seen the truth. One of the hired guns crumpled from his saddle and fell to the ground. The tide had turned. The town was no longer a united front. Clara screamed in frustration and spurred her horse, trying to escape into the night. But Jared was there. He rode out of the darkness and cut her off, his horse blocking her path. "It's over, Clara," he said. She looked at him, her face a mask of pure hatred. "This is all your fault," she hissed. She raised a small pistol she had hidden in her dress. But before she could fire, a rope snaked out of the darkness and settled around her arms, pulling her tight. Eliza sat on her horse, the end of the lariat held firm in her one good hand. "No," Eliza said, her voice clear and strong in the sudden silence. "This is your fault." With Clara and the hired guns captured, Sheriff Miller was left alone and terrified. He threw down his gun and surrendered, begging for his life. They rode back into Westwood not as fugitives, but as victors. The townsfolk came out of their homes, their faces a mixture of confusion and shame. They had been lied to, manipulated by a web of corruption they never even knew existed. The farmer who had fired the shot in their defense stepped forward. "We were wrong," he said, his voice full of regret. "We let fear turn us into monsters." Jared, now a free man with his name cleared, looked at the crowd. "This town has been sick for a long time," he said. "It's time to heal." With the evidence from Thorne's saddlebags and the confessions of the captured men, the whole rotten structure of the Westwood Cattle Company came crashing down. The investigation they started would change the face of the territory for years to come. A few weeks later, standing on the porch of their rebuilt ranch house, Eliza watched the sun set. The land was quiet, peaceful. The scars on her shoulder were healing, but the scars on her heart were finally starting to fade too. Colton came and stood behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About how a letter from a stranger can change the world," she said. He turned her around to face him. His stormy eyes were clear now, filled with a love and a peace she never thought she would see. "You're no stranger, Eliza," he said. "You were just a part of my story I hadn't met yet." They had faced down their ghosts together, and they had won. They had found their home, not in a place, but in each other. They had started with nothing, two broken people on a dusty road, and they had built a future out of courage and hope. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into, and that, even in the darkest of times, one small act of courage can be enough to bring the whole rotten world tumbling down. If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you want more stories about the fight for justice on the untamed frontier, make sure you subscribe. You never know what secrets are waiting to be uncovered.